I love the research I do. I'm passionate about going into the field and collecting animals or just watching animals in the wild. But I do think at the end of the day, to leave a lasting footprint, education is the way to go forward.
Welcome to The Last Word, the official JAALAS podcast dedicated to connecting and informing the laboratory animal science community. Each episode takes a closer look at recent articles published in our journals, JAALAS and LAS Pro, and features interviews with professionals advancing the field. I'm Jennifer Smith, your host. As a laboratory animal veterinarian and the Director of Education and Scientific Affairs at JAALAS, I look forward to sharing these conversations with you. Let's discover something new together. With me today is Dr. Rochelle Buffenstein. Rochelle, or Shelley, is a new friend. She's also a research professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago in the Graduate College. As an experienced researcher with a demonstrated history of working in both academia and biotech, Shelley pioneered the naked mole rat as a novel model for biomedical research. We are thrilled to welcome Shelley here today and look forward to hearing more about her recent JAALAS paper titled A New Laboratory Research Model, the Damaraland Mole Rat and Its Managed Care. Wow, Shelley, I am so glad to meet you and so excited about this paper. When I read it, I was just so happy. It took me back. I have never had the benefit of working with the cousin to the Damaraland mole rat, the naked mole rat, but my cohorts at another university institution had a colony, so they were happy to share stories with me. But anyway, we are so glad to have you here. It would be great if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your research background, your team, and then just really how you got interested in this really unique species.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, for that introduction. And yes, I've been working with naked mole rats for nearly 40-something years now. So it's been a long journey and an interesting and fascinating passion of mine. So to give you a little bit of background to me, I was born in Zimbabwe, which is why I have a strange accent, to the university in South Africa, where I first met the naked mole rat. Like my first job was as a research assistant to Jenny Jarvis, who'd come from Kenya with a colony. And my job was mainly to feed the animals that she kept in her office. Forget about animal facilities in the dark days.
Wow. Oh, okay.
I also collected the Damaraland and other Bathyergid mole rats that are in the same family as the naked mole rat. And my first research interest in the animals in the wild was getting to understand how they lived in the dark with no access to light and what that did to their physiology. So I started studying vitamin D metabolism and calcium homeostasis and the metabolic rates and costs of living in so hostile an environment. When I moved to the States 25 years ago, I was trying to think what I should be really working on. And I'd brought with me a colony of animals I had collected with Jenny in 1980 in Kenya. So not talking about our paper, but talking about sort of how I came to bring mole rats with me. Jenny had been at a conference where Dick Alexander, probably from Michigan, was talking hypothetically about why you don't get eusociality in mammals. He worked on bees and wasps and the social insects and came up with a hunch and theory that the only place you would ever find a eusocial mammal would be in a very hostile environment where you really need a village to find food and to take care of the colony. The guy sitting next to her was a guy called Terry Vaughan from the University of Arizona. He'd written many books on mammalogy, and he turned around to Jenny and said, you know, he's describing the animals you have in your office that you can't get to breed. And so Jenny and I applied to National Geographic for a grant, and 6 months later went with hose and buckets and no really good equipment to try and dig up mole rats in Kenya in the wild. And we had quite an adventure doing so. I could talk about that for hours, but I'll spare you. Suffice to say that we dug up the road the dirt road in Tsavo National Park and had to put it back every night, which was major work. And then we moved further north in a convoy to an area right near the border with Ethiopia and Somalia, where we were in a convoy and then dumped to go and do our research, which was a little frightening. Anyway, we collected animals in the wild, and sure enough, we found only one breeding female in an entire colony. And Jenny came back and wrote her seminal paper on naked mole rat eusociality in 1981. And that started my real interest in mole rats living underground and their ecophysiology. And when I started my first job, I took a colony that we had started breeding with us. And when I moved to America, I brought my colony with me. I think I've given you way too much information. You better edit all of that.
Oh, no, we're not. We love it. So interesting. And thank you for all of that. For so many of us, our research journeys into laboratory animal medicine and, the laboratory animal science community, it just had a very different start. So we just love hearing about that. And especially these really unique species that, they come from somewhere, right? Maybe not just the vendor. And so I think it's really important to hear all of that. So keep going. Yeah. Tell us about the team on the current paper and then, just how you got interested in the haired cousin, I'm going to call it, to the naked mole rat, what we're really talking about today. How did you get there?
Okay. So while I was at the university in South Africa, the hairy relatives are all over the place. So you can't go to the airport without seeing a whole bunch of mounds. And my first personal research wasn't on the naked mole rat, it was on the Damaraland mole rat from Namibia and on Georicus from Cape Town. And as I said, we were looking at vitamin D metabolism in the entire family of the Bathyergids and found, much to our surprise, they were naturally vitamin D deficient at no circulating levels of 25 hydroxy vitamin D, or should I say no detectable levels, and very, very, very low levels of 125 dihydroxy vitamin D. So we did a whole bunch of experiments where we gave them vitamin D to see what happened to their calcium metabolism, and discovered that they did not rely on vitamin D to absorb calcium and that they were extremely efficient at taking up every last drop of calcium. And when you gave them too much vitamin D, they just made their teeth whiter and thicker and sloughed them off. So that was how I came to the Damaraland mole rat. But when I came to America, I brought with me my colony of naked mole rats and was thinking, what kind of research can I do that would be of interest to the States? And at this stage, I'd noticed that my animals were living about 12 to 15 years, which is ridiculously long for a mouse rodent. And so a key area of my research would be to try and understand their aging process. Do they show the physiological declines that we see in all animals from an early age, from middle age, as you know, in humans? And we discovered that they were a very attractive model of successfully slow aging animals. For unlike humans and mice, at ages way beyond their expected maximum lifespans, or in terms of timing of sexual maturity and other developmental milestones, the naked mole rats failed to exhibit any change in physiology, cardiac function, metabolism, no change in morphology, bone density, fat and protein, or in demographic mortality. In fact, they seem to show that death was stochastic. Instead of showing the uptick in dying once you reach the age of about 4 times sexual maturity, when the risk of dying doubles every 8 years for humans and much faster for other species, mole rats went to more than 50 times their age of sexual maturity without reaching that uptick in exponential risk of dying. So that's how I started working in the States, trying to understand what it was about their demographic aging and physiology that might be of biomedical interest. And naturally, the next question you then go, is this unique to the naked mole rats, or is this something that's shared by other subterranean rodents or by their hairy relatives? And I'd also had some Damaraland mole rats that I'd collected in the wild, and I managed to bring them here and then got a few more from a guy who supplies zoos, Ray Mendez. And that's another story that we could laugh about for hours. Damaraland mole rats with their incredibly long teeth and wondering whether there'd be really snakes on the plane with all these little Damaralands running around. So when we flew back with them, at that stage you were allowed to fly with rodents inside the cabin. We took off our shoes and made sure our socked feet were on the cages, constantly feeling to see where they were chewing their way out of.
Oh my goodness. Okay. This is so fascinating. Keep going.
But we managed to get them to New York without incident, despite the fact that our flights got delayed and all sorts of other interesting stories. So that's how I started looking at the Damaraland mole rat here. It was more whatever I was doing in the naked mole rat, did I see something similar in the Damaraland mole rat? And with time, I realized there were a couple of other labs that were now beginning to work with Damaraland mole rats. And I realized people weren't housing their animals properly. So people were constantly telling me they couldn't get their animals to breed, or the animals looked all scruffy and miserable. And I figured it was time to write a paper on how to take care of these animals so that we can get really good science. Because if the animals aren't happy, you're not going to be able to do good research with them. You're not going to be looking at their natural biology. You're going to be looking at the effects of stress on aging or the effects of overcrowding on something. So I decided to write this paper on the Damaraland mole rat as a model for managed care, as a new model for biomedical research and managed care. So as you mentioned, I was working at one stage in biotech. I was working in Google's moonshot company called Calico, which was dedicated to using advanced technologies to understand the biology of aging and develop therapeutics. And when I left that position, I had so many animals that I knew I couldn't bring with me to my new post. I just couldn't handle the 8,000 naked mole rats I had and the 500 Damaraland mole rats I had. So I gave them away to various research institutions all over the world: Japan, South Korea, Germany, England. And I'm very pleased to say that now there are lots of labs working with these animals, and I felt it was essential to write this manuscript. So that's the background of how I came about writing this paper. I gave away all these animals and wanted to make sure they'd be properly looked after so that you could get decent science out of them.
And we are so glad that you did. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing such an interesting history of just sort of how these animals got here and how you got here. And like I say, always, we're so glad you're in Lab Animal with us. And thank you for making the science better and the welfare for the animals better. So I think in your introduction, you've covered a lot of that, but it might be good to just kind of help our listeners know the Damaraland mole rat, the DMR, I'm calling it, has some significant differences. You kind of alluded to that to the naked mole rat. Maybe you could just cover a few of those.
The Damaraland mole rat, like the naked mole rat, is a member of the very speciose family Bathyergidae, although I was at a conference recently and they're now sort of consolidating species down a bit, but the Damaraland mole rat will still remain its own species. It's found naturally in southern and southwestern Africa, in South Africa, Namibia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and it's found mainly in arid thorn-felt biomes. This area is punctuated by long periods of drought. They're closely related to the naked mole rat in that they're in the same family, but they diverged from the naked mole rat 26 million years ago, which is about the same evolutionary distance as you see between humans and macaques. So they're not closely related, but they do share a common evolutionary history. They also share a common type of habitat, and that they are strictly subterranean. They live in burrows that extend between 1 foot and maybe 5 feet beneath the soil surface. They live in family groups of up to 48 individuals and are one of only 2 known eusocial species. And I mentioned that in our earlier section. But what that means is they show cooperative breeding. There's usually only 1 female in the colony, the dominant female, that monopolizes breeding opportunities. And she'll pair with just the one male we pair her with, which is how they differ from naked mole rats. They are incest avoiders. They will not mate with their offspring, whereas the naked mole rats tend to take on 3 or 4 of their sons when they become dominant breeders, and will mate with their sons as well as the male we've paired them with for life. Although there's no evidence of any task specialization amongst the non-breeders, the offspring of the breeding pair that stay in their natal colony way beyond the age of sexual maturity assist in tunnel maintenance and foraging. They bring food back to the nest when they find it, so they share food with their conspecifics. And they also care for the pups. If the pups sort of leave the colony, they will go and grab them and bring them back to the nest area. So that's a little bit of their history. If you think about their environment, living below ground, they're protected from climatic extremes like major swings in temperature or rain and cold, but they also are subjected to poorly ventilated, dark environments. In their burrow system, they feed on bulbs, roots, and tubers, which they find and collect by digging through the soil. Digging through the soil is a very costly process. They dig with their large, extra buccal, procumbent teeth and very powerful jaw muscles. More than 25% of their body mass is in those jaw muscles. They dig with their mouth open, and they have bristles on their lips and flaps of skin around their mouth, which prevents soil from getting into their mouth. So they're pretty well adapted to this lifestyle of living in sealed underground burrows.
That is so fascinating, and we really appreciate all that background. So just kind of moving through your article, for those that are following along, you do such a good job of giving us a foundation for housing, husbandry, breeding, their just general care in the laboratory animal facility environment. It'd be great if you could talk through some of that for us.
Yes, so I've already alluded to some of that in that they do live in large groups, and they're very clean animals. They do all their excreta in a toilet or latrine. And so keeping them in a large rat cage is really not an ideal situation. What I've done in captivity, I don't house them in a Rolls-Royce facility like my German colleague. Mine's more like a 1960 Toyota. I house them in standard rat cages that are interconnected with plexiglass tubing, so that they have at least 4 chambers in which they can choose to make one a toilet, one I put the food in, which I call the pantry, a nest chamber, and then another chamber. And the bigger the colony, the more chambers they have to use and figure out how they want to arrange the colony. I try and arrange it in a U shape so that the toilet is near a blind ending chamber near the front, but they might decide that that's not where they want it. And they're really in charge of how they sort out their living arrangements, not me. We keep the room relatively warm. We try and keep it above 25 degrees centigrade, preferably between 27 and 30. And we also give them a heating blanket, one of those bunny blankets that I think you routinely use in veterinary care. And they will usually make their nest chamber on top of that bunny blanket. So even though they've got fur, they like to keep it warm. And despite the fact that they weigh 160 grams, so they're the size of a rat rather than a mouse, they clamber on top of each other and really pad their little environment where everybody's sleeping on top of each other. And we've had USDA inspectors tell us, oh, your system's overcrowded. You need to give them bigger cages. And then we show them if we put a mouse cage and a rat cage in a big restaurant-sized chamber, they'll all be in the smallest chamber, crammed in, because that's how they like it. In the wild, they'd probably make a chamber the size of a football, not much bigger. We've found that there are different types of bedding you can use. I use the diamond paper, which seems to work quite well as long as you change the toilet regularly. The diet we provide them in captivity is primarily yams. They really like sweet potatoes and yams and sweet foods. They don't eat potatoes in my care, and they don't eat any meat products, although I was at a conference last week where someone said they fed them chicken. One of the zoos said they fed them chicken, which, as far as I know, is ridiculous. But as my animals have always been herbivorous, they don't eat insects or mealworms or earthworms. I've tried them on all sorts of things, and they just ignore those kinds of foods. They tend to like sweet fruit and vegetables, so they love oranges. If you cut just the top of an orange off, they'll burrow into it, eat everything, including the pulp, and then go sleep in there, make it into their little nest. So they like oranges and butternut squash. They even eat bananas, which wouldn't be something you would find them eating in the wild. Their foods in the wild tend to be the size of garlic bulbs or carrots, but they're prone to eat anything we offer them in captivity.
So fascinating. We'd love to hear more about the breeding.
So the Damaraland mole rat, as I said, avoids incest. So even if you try and mate a female with her brother after years of separation, they don't tend to breed. How I get breeding pairs is I take females and males from different colonies, house them on their own for usually a week or more, and then pair them. And the Damaralands tend to be induced ovulators, so shortly after pairing, you'll see the female drumming and the animals chasing each other around quite crazily, and then they'll mate. And as often as 6 or 7 days after separating them from their colony, she'll fall pregnant. Their gestation period is pretty long. It's usually 11 weeks. So we find that they breed about 3 times a year. They have a 10-day postpartum estrus, so they're either pregnant and lactating or pregnant. So they're always doing something reproductive. Interestingly, their pup litter size is quite small. A newly formed breeding pair will have between 1 and 3 pups. An established breeding female will have more pups. The biggest litter I've ever had was 8, with an average of 4 to 6 in an established female and 1 to 3 in a newly formed breeding pair. They're generally much easier to pair than naked mole rats are. Naked mole rats are much more xenophobic and will attack a foreign animal very rapidly if you put it into the wrong colony, whereas the Damaraland mole rats seem to be quite keen on having newcomers come into their colony. We found that they have very low incidence of inbreeding. Their genetics shows that they're as heterozygous as human populations. So they obviously, despite living in colonies with only a single breeding female that does all the reproduction, they seem to get outsiders coming in the wild and maintain quite a lot of genetic diversity.
Wow. This information is so helpful, and we so appreciate just all of your long history with these animals and your willingness to share, and especially the paper in JAALAS. So thank you again. I can't believe we're coming to the end of our time. I feel like I could listen to you all day, talk about your background and your research, but we do have to wrap it up. So I have a final question for you. We ask this sort of final question of everyone, and today for you, it's what advice would you give to researchers trying to set up a program with this unique species?
My easy answer is just do it. There's so many thousands of interesting questions that these animals will help us resolve. We're only slowly beginning to understand their importance in biomedical research. Their tolerance of hypoxia is of incredible interest in terms of heart disease, ischemia, reperfusion injury, brain stroke, and the likes thereof. And we've already learned so much about them in just that area. Their sensory biology is fascinating. There are only a few hundred papers on the species compared to the 8 or 9 million on C57 black 6 mice. So I think there are millions of interesting questions that these species could answer that are of direct relevance to human health and animal health and welfare. So my basic answer to that is, my advice is just do it. Follow the protocols and how to house them. Give them space so they can be happy in their colonies, and you'll have hundreds of very interesting papers that'll come out of it that might even lead to therapeutics moving forward.
Oh, my goodness. I love it. Thank you for that. A really great answer. And thank you for being an amazing resource for this species, also for the less haired cousin, the naked mole rat species. Your contact info will be in the show notes. You are just a wealth of knowledge, and as well as your paper in JAALAS. We so appreciate that. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Last Word. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so be sure to leave your feedback in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more great content. We encourage you to submit your research manuscripts to our journals, JAALAS and LAS Pro. We're always looking to feature impactful studies. You can also connect with us on our social media channels or email us directly at info@alas.org. We appreciate your listening today, and we'll see you next time on The Last Word, an ALAS podcast. Until then, stay curious and stay connected.